Hey folks, so today we're going to be talking about ways that we can conduct research. We've sort of been talking about it in our conferences, all the different ways that we can conduct research and collect data. But this week we are going to be focusing on just kind of touching on what are research methods, just more broadly. Then I will work to define the difference between qualitative and quantitative data, which will be very important in this stage of DYOP. And then because one of our assignments coming up is about specifically ethnographic research, I'm going to delve into what ethnographic research is a little bit more in depth. So that way you are prepared to work on your ethnographic journals. So first, what are research methods, right? Put very, very simply, research methods are the methods that we use to conduct research. And I know that sounds silly, me framing it in that way, but it really is. That really is what it is. It's the ways that we as researchers go about conducting research and collecting data. And there are a lot of different ways that we can collect data for research purposes and for our research process. But those methods, while there are many, should be chosen very carefully based on things like your research question, who is likely to be impacted by your research. So if you are doing interviews, for example, you are working with human participants, and that requires a lot of planning, a lot of care. And if that is something that within the scope of your research, you do not have time to take the time and care and planning to do, then that is not an effective method for your overall rhetorical purpose for your research. But you also have to think about something like, is it feasible within my given time frame, right? Am I realistically going to be able to conduct a study or conduct an experiment with 1,000 participants as my sample size in 7 weeks? No, absolutely not. But is it more feasible for me to maybe get in touch with 2 or 3, maybe 5 if I'm feeling ambitious, right? So we have to think about all of these things whenever we are trying to decide which research methods are best for our particular research idea. And this is where we get into this conversation about quantitative data versus qualitative data. The way that we conduct our research determines the type of data that we can then collect because of the method that we chose. So let's break down really the difference between quantitative and qualitative data. Qualitative data is collected mainly in the humanities and in the social sciences, but a lot of this can be interdisciplinary, right? So there might be a lot of overlap happening. The data with qualitative data is merely subjective because you are relying on the participant, the person who has agreed to participate with you, and their point of view, their perspectives, in order to get some sort of information from them. And qualitative data is really useful because it allows researchers to see how a participant's thoughts, feelings, perspectives, or even lived experiences can impact an event or a situation. And then after that, we can try and make meaning from that. So, for example, if anybody has ever told you that your lived experiences don't count as evidence or don't count as data, they're wrong because they absolutely do. What we then as researchers then get to do is have really cool conversations with participants who want to share a perspective with us. And then based off of our evidence and our research, we get to decide or get to sort of interpret how that can actually impact our research. Then you have quantitative data, which is collected mainly in the social sciences and in the natural sciences. You may have noticed that social sciences is on there twice. And it's because I like to joke that the social sciences only exist because the humanities and the natural sciences got together, had a baby, and boom, there you have the social sciences. So while the social sciences look at human participants, we also use the scientific method similar to the natural sciences. So that's why it can also be interdisciplinary. You may find that you are maybe having larger conversations about natural phenomena as it impacts human people, right? So there's that interdisciplinary, that crossover. With quantitative data, it's important to know that this data is purely objective, right? We are not having a dialogue or a conversation with people. It is merely based off of observations from the researcher. We are not asking for perspectives from the participants. We are literally just looking at raw data that we can then observe and then make meaning from. And quantitative data can be useful because it allows researchers to really look at some sort of numeric output from a series of data collection, and then we can make meaning from that. Sometimes there's not enough time to conduct interviews, and that's okay. But how can we still look at maybe fixed responses and then try and understand what those fixed responses may mean? With qualitative data, it's important to know that the setup for qualitative data takes a lot less time, right? If we decide to do an interview, maybe we jot down some questions, we conduct the interview. Boom, there you go. Whereas with quantitative data, there's more setup time because the responses are not as open-ended as they are with qualitative data. So we might take time to create surveys. We may make, or even if there are interview questions, what types of interview questions, maybe there's a back and forth, maybe there's a review process. The time to conduct an observation or an experiment takes longer. It takes longer to set up with quantitative data. But the difference is with qualitative data, after we have that initial setup, we then get to spend more time analyzing that data compared to quantitative data measures. So because the responses with qualitative data are so open-ended, we then, as the researchers, have to take the time to really understand what that data means. Whereas with quantitative data, if somebody used a Likert scale, the less likely, more than likely, neutral, right? Those are the responses, right? There's nothing left to understand from that. Just a percentage of people said neutral, a percentage of people said more likely, less likely. It's a quick glance, a quick look into what the data might say. But where qualitative data and quantitative data are really different is that with qualitative data, it allows you to go really in depth with participants because you are examining fewer participants in order to collect that data. So, for example, if I am conducting qualitative data research, right, and I'm doing an interview, I may only have time to interview 3 or 4 people and then look at all of their responses and see what the running themes or codes are within their responses. Whereas if I only created a survey, I might be able to survey 200 people and then look at the data from that. So you see the differences? Like there's a lot of lead up with quantitative data, but there's a lot of fallout with qualitative data. Because the responses from participants are less structured with qualitative data, that's why it takes so long, right? We want the open-endedness from it so that way we can really try and hear people's perspectives. But at the same time, while the responses are less structured, that requires the researcher to be more structured because it requires us to organize those responses in a very particular way. So that way we can effectively code and understand and make meaning from the data. But because with qualitative data collection, the methods are purely number-based, it's a lot easier for us to make sort of broad and general claims. So while qualitative data is more specific, it's less general, right? So we can't make a general claim with qualitative data. We can only make very specific claims based off of what participants have said. Rather, with quantitative data, we can say, well, 30% said that they were neutral on this. And then we can sort of infer from there. Whereas with qualitative data, there is no room for inference because the participant told us exactly what they were thinking and what they were feeling in their lived experiences. It's important to know, like I put some of these words down to kind of help us think about ways that we can write about this type of data. So if we think about qualitative data, it is descriptive, right? We are not just saying on a scale of 1 to 5, how do you feel about this? It's tell me how you feel about this given circumstance, right? It requires us to have some sort of dialogue. It might even allow us to embrace the senses, like how do you feel, how do you see, smell, taste, hear. It really ties in very nicely with pathos and kairos, because we're thinking about sense of time and place in order to have a conversation or a dialogue with participants. We're thinking about our thoughts and feelings and the rhetorical choices made with the language that we use in order to convey that data, right? Whereas with quantitative data, it's numerical, it's objective. It requires something that I like to refer as mechanical skills. So think about like problem solving or even like theoretical and spatial knowledge. So you might need to understand a theory before you can apply that and solve a potential problem based off of the data. But also it's continuous, right? Because we are just collecting raw data and numerical values, it can always be measured and it can always be conducted and repeated in the same way. And this is where we see like logos come into play with our rhetorical choices. Like, how are we going to create some sort of method to collect data that really allows us to hone in on the statistical output of what the data is trying to tell us? So, but I said that a lot of these things might be interdisciplinary, which might be kind of confusing. Like interdisciplinary, the natural sciences and the humanities, what do you mean? Well, this is where we get this idea called mixed methods. It's where we have qualitative research and quantitative research, and we may want to do a little bit of both, right? Maybe we want to do interviews, but maybe we also want to do surveys, right? And that's where we get something called mixed methods research approaches. So you can have purely qualitative research methods or purely quantitative, but you might, especially if you're taking an interdisciplinary approach, meaning that it's not purely natural sciences, it's not purely social sciences or humanities, it might be best for you to kind of combine methods, and that's okay too. For DYOP, we are actually practicing utilizing mixed methods approaches. So moving on specifically to ethnographic research, which is a type of qualitative data research. What is it, right? We have an ethnographic journal coming up, but what exactly does it do? So ethnographic research is a method of research that is designed to examine, understand, and collect data about cultures or groups of people. At its core level, it is just a way for us to collect data about humans. It can be conducted in a lot of different ways over long periods of time. You can do it over shorter periods of time, but ethnographic research is truly designed to see how people change and how cultures and languages change over time. But it also requires us to be a little bit more holistic, since the main area of focus for collecting our data is humans. And humans are complicated, they are convoluted, and they are not just one thing. If you've ever been to the doctor and you know something's wrong with you, but the doctor is like, well, according to your blood tests, everything's normal, so you must be okay. That's an example of a doctor looking at quantitative data and making a decision and making meaning from that. If the doctor took a qualitative approach, they might ask you more holistic questions like, so your blood work is normal, but you're telling me that you don't feel good. What about your body doesn't feel good? Let's take a look at that. You see the difference? So when we take a holistic approach, it's not just looking at what test results say, it's also looking at the person, the individual. So ethnography, because of this, ethnography requires a dialogue. It requires a conversation between the researcher and the participants in order to have meaningful conclusions about the research that we're conducting. How do we conduct ethnographic research? This was a big question during our conferences, and there's a lot of ways that we can go about doing it. It can be conducted by an individual or a team of people. It's typically longitudinal research, meaning that it is data collected over a period of time. It is not just quick glances, it is not just quick surveys, it is data collected over a period of time. It can be conducted in any place or any circumstance. I would just hazard you to think about what that might be within the confines of your research question. Is it more rhetorically chiropractic for you to conduct interviews in a church if your research question is about not being religious? You see? So like think about time and place and the circumstance that you were conducting the interview, and you as the researcher control all of that. So just things to consider as you're conducting your ethnographic research. It's important to know that ethnography prioritizes working with participants versus viewing them as objects. That's why I keep saying the word participants. People who opt to participate in our research, they are not research objects. They are participants. They are participating with us. It's a partnership. And that's why this thing called informed consent is so important. Your participants have to know what you are researching, how you are researching, what their role as the participant is, what your role as the researcher is. And at any point, they can pull out. They can say, you know what, I'm not okay with being in this research. And you have to adjust accordingly, right? Part of working with humans and taking a holistic approach is also letting them say no. Whereas if we were examining an inanimate object, for example, there is no consent needed because it's inanimate. It's an object that we can just purely look at. It's numerical. But because humans are not numerical, they require more collaboration than simply just looking at data. Similarly, the tools that you use to collect this data are a little bit more fluid. You can use whatever you want or what you can afford. If the thing that you can afford is a dollar notebook from Dollar General in order to take notes, then you can conduct ethnographic research with it. If the thing that you require is software for your computer in order to make, visual ethnography, that is something that you can choose to do. It's a little bit where, compared to quantitative data, it might require a lab, it might require materials. Ethnographic research allows you to be kind of open-ended with the things that you choose to conduct your research. But ultimately, this is your responsibility as the researcher. You are the researcher and you set the parameters. So you come up with the questions, you come up with the time and place, you come up with a list of potential participants, and you have to make sure that they can consent to the parameters that you set. You're in control, but the participant still gets a choice on whether or not they get to participate. Some things to expect after you have conducted ethnographic research: you'll develop social skills and learn things from others, which will ultimately make you a more credible researcher. I feel like a lot of times, especially in with an online class, it's hard to conceptualize how research can make us social, but doing something like ethnographic research and collecting qualitative data requires us to have that conversation, requires us to be social. And it could be challenging, but it's very rewarding. You'll also learn how to create boundaries between your personal and your professional life, which is something that doesn't just apply to school, it applies to everything. You'll also learn when it's appropriate to integrate the two. If you've ever been in a situation where you're at your job and you got a little too personal with your coworkers, and then everybody started talking about you and your personal stuff, this kind of research methodology will get you to practice what's appropriate and what's not, drawing those lines, creating those boundaries. And then you get to decide when is the best opportunity to allow personal and professional to overlap. You might also learn other skills that you didn't think of learning, like learning a new language. You can learn more about your research and your writing process, what works and what doesn't. And you can also look at the data you've collected and really make meaning from the research based off of your own sense of rhetorical purpose. Why did we research this? Why did I ask this question? Why is this relevant, right? These are very hard questions that we get to ask ourselves as researchers. And then that creates our own sense of exigence, right? That's what sets you apart from others that have been doing this conversation already. You are continuing this ongoing conversation because of these kinds of questions you ask yourself. There are a lot of different ways for you to collect ethnographic research data. The three main ones are conducting interviews, observations, and then archival research. Interviews, I think everybody can kind of knows what an interview might be. But there's all different kinds of interviews. There's job interviews, there's news interviews, there's research interviews. So think about how you might have a conversation with somebody and how that exchange might lead to more data collection. Then there's observations. So these could be observation or field notes where you are just in a space making observations as needed. There's participant observation, which is like, I am a participant at an event with other participants, and I am making observations about how I feel at this event, while also making observations in the field about how others are feeling at a given event. Then there's archival research. This can be all sorts of things. This could be looking at texts. This could be looking at or comparing two different documents. This is analysis work, synthesis work. It's looking at maybe what the literature, what the research is saying, or what peer-reviewed articles are saying, and then trying to understand and draw meaning and maybe apply it to things like your interview questions or your observations. There's a lot of different ways for us to go about doing that. And archival is just sort of a way that we phrase it, but it's not in the archives necessarily. It's just how we are reading and understanding a situation fully based off of what the conversation is already happening. So what do you do after you collect all of this data, right? You're going to develop something called a coding scheme. These are descriptive labels, words, or phrases that identify themes or patterns in your research and your data. When we were talking about this during our conferences, I said we're going to be taking a look at the themes in the research, right, or codes. This is where it gets used interchangeably. Some disciplines refer to them as themes, some refer to them as codes. So in this case, a coding scheme requires us to have a question. So let's just say, for example, my research question is, how does the school to prison pipeline in K through 12 public schools impact course learning outcomes in first-year composition classrooms? My coding scheme, based off of this question or theme, like based off of this question, my coding scheme and or the themes that I'm looking at might be lack of access to educational, financial, medical, social, and spiritual resources impacts learning. Over-policing in K through 12 public schools breeds an environment of fear, promotes individualism, and or discourages collaborative learning environments. The more identities students possess, the more likely they are to focus on survival and less on learning. So these codes or these themes that I have created as a result of a research question don't really tell you anything about the sources yet, but they allow me to sort of sort the sources thematically. And then I can synthesize how they are relevant to the question later, which we'll get to whenever we talk about synthesizing data next week or in module 5 as it relates to our synthesis matrix assignment. You should also identify potential outliers to your research and figure out what doesn't fit within your coding scheme. If you realize that one of your sources, while useful when you were kind of reading and sort of gathering data, doesn't fit within your themes or your coding scheme, you get to ask yourself a really important question, which is this source truly relevant to my research? Sometimes it is. And sometimes we may have to rethink our coding scheme, maybe add another code, happens all the time. Or more often than not, sometimes we just have to get rid of the source. I know that seems like a lot of work to do, but it's a lot easier to have more research and narrow it down than it is to have just the perfect amount of sources and then realize it doesn't work. So even though DYOP requires us to have 5 to 6 sources, if you have like maybe 7 or 8, and then it turns out one doesn't work, you're still meeting the assignment requirements. You see what I mean? After you collect your data, you can also connect your findings to larger theories or frameworks. And these might already be in the research as well in like a literature review. So how are we backing up the data that we've collected with evidence that is already in the ongoing conversation, that is already established in that conversation? And then finally, you should keep track of your biases. Research, despite what you've been told, is not purely objective, clearly, because qualitative data is subjective. But we are also human beings that come into research with our own thoughts, feelings, perspectives about the world that we live in. And so, of course, our biases are going to come into play here. So you should reflect often and ask yourself really hard questions. Is this what the participant is saying, or is this what I want them to say? And that's a very hard question to ask, because a lot of times we want to answer our questions so much that we sort of make an inference about what the participant is saying rather than what they have actually said. So sometimes we have to take a step back and be like, is that what I want them to say? Or is that what they're actually saying? So sometimes we just have to pause and check our biases. And if you're not sure if you are completely removing your sense of bias from your research, ask for help. Research is collaborative, and it requires us to, if we can't check ourselves, then somebody can check us for us. And that's what peer review research is all about. So whenever you hear the phrase peer review, it's not necessarily folks that are in class with you, but they're people in a similar field as you that understand the language of the field and know what the field expects. So if you have displayed bias and a colleague of yours has identified that bias, it's important to listen to that, because it only makes you more credible later on, and it strengthens your own sense of ethos. So that is our presentation about conducting research and collecting initial data. In Module 5, we will talk about synthesizing data as it pertains to the synthesis matrix. In the meantime, make sure that you are meeting with your research librarian and you are beginning your ethnographic journals. If you need anything in the meantime, please do not hesitate to email me, and we can always schedule office hours. Thank you.